Are you ready for your thought-provoking question of the day? Got one for you. Don't answer it out loud. Just think about it. Here's the question. What is the difference between a great leader and a tyrant? Just think about it. I don't want you to answer out loud because we could spend all day having that discussion. And given the current political climate, it might not be a very pleasant one. But just think about it. What is the difference between a great leader and a tyrant? Well, I do believe there is a clear line between the two. There's a clear line between a tyrant and a good leader. But there is a sense in which I would say that the answer to that question is this. The difference between a tyrant and a good leader is often perspective. In other words, one man's great leader might be another man's tyrant. Consider, for instance, Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. Now, to the north, Lincoln was a crusader for justice. He stood up against the unspeakably cruel establishment of slavery and fought to preserve the unity of the United States at all costs. To the north, he was a great leader, a hero. To the south, on the other hand, they had a very different perspective. To them, he was a despot. He pushed the agenda of the federal government on the southern states, and he ignored how that agenda would affect their lives. To the south, he was a tyrant. Do you see what I mean? In a sense, the difference between a great leader and a tyrant is perspective. In other words, those who are on the leader's side might see him as a great leader, and his enemies might consider him a tyrant. Keep that in mind this morning as we continue our series, The King Has Come. During this series, we're looking at 3 psalms, 3 sacred poems from the Bible, and these are specifically considered royal psalms. As you may recall from last week, poetry communicates the desires, feelings, beliefs, attitudes, ideas, and values of a person or a culture through a few carefully selected words. The royal psalms were written in honor of the king during the time of ancient Israel, and they often expressed what the psalmist hoped would come out of that king's reign. Today I'd like us to look at one of these royal psalms, Psalm 2. Many scholars believe that along with Psalm 1, Psalm 2 provides an introduction to the rest of the book of Psalms. They believe that whoever assembled this collection of sacred poetry wanted these 2 psalms to set the tone for the other 148. So, if we're going to take a look at Psalm 2, let's start by looking at Psalm 1 so we can get a little background, a little bit of context. Here's Psalm 1. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this psalm. We're focusing on Psalm 2 today. But basically, Psalm 1 contrasts the person who pursues God's way of life with the person who pursues his own way of life. They have very different fates. The person who lives God's way is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. On the other hand, the one who chooses his own way over God's way is like chaff that the wind blows away. This one will not stand in the judgment, nor in the assembly of the righteous. So keep that contrast between those who live God's way and those who don't in mind as we take a look at Psalm 2. So here's Psalm 2. This is the psalm we're focusing on this morning. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies him in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with an iron rod. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss the Son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Now, just like Psalm 72 from last week, this psalm may have been read at the coronation of the king. In other words, when someone new was being installed as the king of Israel. And if that was the case, someone else, perhaps a priest, might have read the first 6 verses, and the king would have responded with the other half. Now, let's take a closer look at this psalm. Let's break it down a little bit and unpack what's here. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The word translated nations is goyim, a word that Jews even today use for Gentiles or non-Jews. So the nations and the peoples are non-believers, those who are outside of the community of faith. In this psalm, these people and their leaders band together against the Lord and against his anointed. The word for anointed is Messiah. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Messiah. Messiah, the word used for the coming Savior that you and I know to be Jesus. But before it was used in that way, it was simply a generic term for the king. It seems as though all of the world in this psalm is against God and against the king who represents him. These people don't, as Psalm 1 puts it, delight in the law of the Lord or meditate on his law day and night, but rather walk in step with the wicked, stand in the way that sinners take, and sit in the company of mockers. You see, God calls us to be accountable for our actions, particularly those with moral implications. And we, human beings, don't always like that. We like to be free, self-determinate, independent, autonomous. We don't want anyone telling us what to do or how to live. We would characterize anyone who tries to do so as a tyrant. And perhaps we have a point when it comes to doing what other flawed human beings tell us, but not when it comes to doing what God tells us. The difference is that unlike human beings, God is the one who truly thinks clearly. God is the one who truly has all the facts. God is the one who knows more about the way this world works, than any of us. We would be fools not to take his advice. But no, that's not what we see when we look at Psalm 2. What we see is a world that responds to God's authority, however life-giving it might be, with hostility. They see him as a tyrant to be overthrown and not a benevolent creator caring for the people he created. Then the psalmist describes how he pictures God responding. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Now, God doesn't laugh because he's happy or because he really thinks there's something funny about this situation. It's a response to the ludicrous. Finite, flawed human beings think they know better than an all-powerful, all-knowing, transcendent God. More than that, they're actively hostile to him. That's like an ant thinking it can stand up to a Mack truck. It's like a slug trying to match wits with Einstein. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. A lot of us don't like to talk about God's wrath. That's the side of God a lot of us have trouble with. But I want to make something very clear. God's wrath is an expression of his love. Now that is a foundation to our understanding of God in our tradition. God's wrath is actually an expression of his love. Because when God acts out of his wrath, he's usually trying to accomplish one of two things. Either he's trying to get someone's attention so that they can turn their lives around, or he's trying to protect his people. Most of the time, he's doing both. And both of those goals emerge out of God's love for human beings. In this particular case, he's trying to get these rebellious people's attention so that they can change their ways. Now notice, he doesn't kill them. He doesn't wipe them out or wipe them from the map. It says he rebukes them. That's basically the same as telling a child no when he's about to stick his finger in a light socket. That's what a rebuke is. And he terrifies them. Now that might rub you a little bit the wrong way, but consider this. When a parent or a teacher raises her voice to get a child's attention, to sober him up, to get him to realize that the situation is serious, well, let's be honest. What's the child's response to that adult raising her voice? It's scary, because that's what motivates him to wake up and pay attention. And when done in appropriate situations, it can keep the child from persisting down a path that might be destructive to himself or to someone else. God does not terrify people because he's a bully. He terrifies people to wake them up, to get their attention. And apparently one of his instruments in trying to get the people's attention is the king. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Here's where the king would begin to read his part. He announces his own intimate relationship with God. And so the picture here is God is adopting the king as his child. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. So if asked, according to the psalmist, God would give the king power over other nations, including his enemies. God would demonstrate his authority over all the world through his adopted son, the king. Therefore, now anytime you see therefore in the Bible, you need to pay attention. Because whenever you see therefore in the Bible, the writer is about to take everything he just told you and tell you what it means for you, or what it means for his audience. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. So instead of being hostile to God's authority, the psalmist says, embrace it. Show God and the king who represents him proper respect. Live his way and see what a difference that makes. Live his way and see how rewarding and enriching it is. Now, yes, the psalmist uses words like fear and trembling, but he also uses the word celebrate. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So just like in Psalm 1, the ways of the righteous and of the wicked are contrasted. Now, the Hebrew translated kiss the son is actually unclear. Nobody really knows what the original Hebrew phrase here means. Kiss the son is a best guess. But when we look at the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was completed about 130 years before Jesus, it actually reads, accept correction. Get an education. In other words, listen up. Learn. Turn things around before it's too late. You see, God doesn't want people to take the path of destruction. This whole psalm is about him trying to stop it from happening. But when people abandon his ways and keep heading that direction, no matter how many times God tries to get their attention, destruction is the ultimate consequence. You know, this psalm is quoted several places in the New Testament. It probably comes as no shock to you that Jesus is seen in the New Testament as the ultimate fulfillment of the hopes and promises in this psalm. In the book of Acts, the first Christians quote the first 2 verses of this psalm as part of a prayer. In Revelation, John quotes, "break them with a rod of iron" 3 different times, although he tends to prefer the Greek rendering, "rule them with an iron scepter." Both Paul and the author of Hebrews were especially fond of, "You are my son, today I have become your father." The author of Hebrews even quotes that one twice. "You are my son, today I have become your father." You may not realize it, but today is another special day in the Christian year. The Christian year on an annual basis retells the story of Jesus, and today is known as the baptism of the Lord. Today we remember the day when Jesus began his ministry. Today we remember the day that Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River by his cousin John, an event that is depicted by a work of art in the entryway to this church. Today we remember when a voice declared from heaven, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Friends, Psalm 2 was written before Jesus came. It was written in a time very different from ours and, frankly, very different from his. It was written not with Jesus in mind, but rather it was written for a mere human king. Nevertheless, it should be obvious to us, as it was to the first Christians, that the hopes expressed in this psalm were fulfilled by Jesus. And the same advice the psalmist gives to the Gentile kings of the earth applies to us. God has truly empowered a man as his anointed king, one who is his son in a way much closer to literal, and one who will one day claim authority over all the earth. Dismiss him as a tyrant if you want, but you will miss out. If instead you learn from him and embrace him as the rightful authority over your life, you will find yourself increasingly fulfilled in the deepest ways on into eternity. Now, that doesn't mean your life will be perfect. There are still people and spiritual forces that are hostile to God, and by extension, anyone on his side. There are still those who view him as a tyrant, and anyone who lives in obedience to him as an instrument of his oppression. But you and I know better. We know that God's commands are for our good. They do not negate our individuality. They do not unnecessarily restrict our creativity or our inventiveness. There is still so much room within the bounds of God's expectations for individual expression. No, God's commands are for our good. All they do is keep us from walking down a road that leads to destruction. They are not the oppressive laws of a tyrant, but the wise advice of a loving Father. And so let us freely embrace the kingship, the lordship of his Son, Jesus.